Okay, our next speaker has been sitting here patiently all day and she is fantastic. She is a very inspirational young woman indeed. Her name is Anna Lee and she is giving a talk on Keep Your Brain on the Game. Her name, yes, as I said, is Anna Lee. She runs an Adelaide consultancy specialising in organisational cultural change, mitigating unconscious bias and women's development programs. She and her husband Jamie, who's a primary school teacher, respect, are attempting to level their own patch of turf by both working part-time and modelling non-stereotypical roles for their son and daughter. Sometimes it works. Please welcome to the lectern, Anna Lee.
Thank you, Amanda. Great to be here today, and I'm especially pleased to see so many people still in the room because I'm aware that we've had a lot of really high-profile speakers here today, and I very much appreciate you staying till the end game because what I'm going to do is hopefully ensure that the inspiration that you've experienced today turns into some really tangible actions, both on the personal but hopefully also on the organisational fronts. So throughout today, like most of you, I have made a really big effort to appear like a knowledgeable, educated, rational grown-up. In fact, today I've made more effort than most days. Not every day I'm sitting on a table with the most senior public servant in Australia or people such as Rabia Sadiq, CEs from the South Australian public sector. So when one is in such company, one makes a particular effort to appear knowledgeable, educated and rational. Well, folks, I'm not the only one in the room who may be knowledgeable, definitely educated, and absolutely far from rational. Knowledgeable and educated we all may be. Rational we most certainly are not. Yes, we can learn to make rational decisions. We can even learn to follow through with rational action. But the design of the human brain means that to think and act rationally consistently, so that is to use objective logic as the key criteria on which we base our perceptions, our beliefs, our actions, is nigh on impossible. And we've actually heard a lot about that irrationality of the human brain today in relation to unconscious bias and stereotyping. It's quite clear that we have a very different reaction when we see exactly the same behaviour dependent upon whether or not the person exhibiting it is a man or a woman. And our brain is equally irrational and unhelpful when it comes to supporting us to follow through on good intentions. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about why that's the case. I'm intending to get you all to commit to a small action that you can perform consistently to level the playing field in your patch of turf. And I'm going to introduce a couple of concepts that are really useful for you to apply in any domain of your life when you're wanting to keep your brain, your attention, your focus on the things that matter most. So the kind of irrationality, and there's lots to choose from, that I'm going to talk about today, is one with which I suspect we're all pretty familiar. It's that universal experience of knowing what is the right thing to do, the thing that will give us the greatest benefit, and not doing it. So I imagine I'm not the only one who alarmingly frequently has the very rational thought of, that's my last glass, I'm sticking to water from now on. Only minutes before raising the said glass brimming with another drop to my lips, or failing to calculate the total cost of my morning Chibo latte because if I did, I'm fairly sure I would discover that the annual total, wisely invested, would have me retiring a year earlier and perhaps not gazing out the window all alone. And because of this tendency for our brain to change track just when we're about to follow through on a really good intention, we can find ourselves, no matter how motivated, how inspired, how much we truly believe that action is worth taking, failing to take just the action that we need to. And because we usually only reveal this inability to respond to reason to ourselves or to our closest confidants, I am going to give you a few personal examples from my recent experience. And before I go into a litany of Anna's foolish acts, I do want to go on securing work in this town. So I want to make quite clear that I'm doing so purely to provide some examples of humanity's foolishness in general, not Anna's foolishness in specific. So the first example of foolishness I'm going to show is what happened when I had the very rational thought of, I need to finish up now if I'm going to get to that meeting in time. Parking is going to be tight. And my irrational response was, oh, don't be silly, you can finish off a few more emails. This is what happened. Adelaide City Council became $48 the richer. I was right, parking was tight. All that was available to me was a half-hour parking slot. In the next picture, you see what happened when I ignored the very rational thought of better avoid the side of the footpath which is riddled with tree roots. And if that's not bad enough, I then followed it up with a week of rational thinking about how I should be applying Dettol on a daily basis and failing to do so. And actually, I was going to wear a skirt today, but semi-heeled scabs and nylon aren't really a good mix. So I'll move on from that one quite quickly. This is a photo of a corner of my home study about 6 months ago. And as you can see, it was used for pretty much anything other than studying. And every time I walked into my study, I would glance into the corner and feel kind of dispirited and moderately depressed. And I would follow that emotional experience with the rational thought of, I need to take that stuff to Vinnie's this weekend. And you should know that that pile of stuff is about a 20-step walk from my car boot. And I drive past Vinnie's every single day. How long did it take me to follow up my daily rational thought with rational action? Let's just say it was between about 6 months and a year, and I'm not joking. So all of those are great examples of how our brain, while it can be incredibly helpful, fails to be so consistently. Fortunately, as we heard a bit from Martin this morning, there are tools and processes that we can put in place to help mitigate our brain's tomfoolery at least some of the time. Unfortunately, those processes consume both time and cognitive energy, so it's impossible to use them to direct all of our thoughts and actions. And the rest of the time, we are left with a misguided, flawed, irrational mass of cells that I think can best be compared to a toddler. And it's not a very palatable thought. And I'm sure, given the illustrious company in which we are presented today, that many of you have learnt to tame your toddler, and particularly in the professional domain. But just think about the similarity between your brain and toddlers. Easily distracted by bright lights and electronic noises. Just think of the ping of a voicemail or internet headlines. guaranteed to behave appallingly in critical situations. Think about job interviews or first dates, and pretty much rendered utterly useless with a lack of sleep, hydration and food. Just think how you feel when you've skipped lunch, drunk too much coffee and have been up till 3 a.m. writing a report. And if we think about how a toddler might impact on the outcomes of today, it's time to revisit how we take away what we've learnt and what we do with it. So if you think that perhaps you're one of the rare few who have learnt to tame your toddler and will leave today and do exactly what you intended to do, good on you, go for it. But for most of us, and particularly for leaders who these days are constantly bombarded with information, research, workshops, case studies about how we can improve our own performance, our team's performance, our organisational performance, that sense of knowing what we should do and failing to do it can become almost the norm. So the pattern can become good intention, and your good intention might be to review the evaluation report on that latest project to make sure that you can apply key learnings in future. And you know that this will be really valuable to both yourself and your organisation. What do we tend to do? Either leave it in the in tray, stick it in the bottom drawer, and never refer to it again. And for an event like today, it's a really familiar feeling to be here, feeling energised and motivated and inspired. We've heard from some incredible speakers today. But the risk is that we leave without putting anything into action, because certainly this is the first Gender Equality and Leadership Summit, but I'm sure it's not the first of these kind of events that you've been to. And for most of you, I'm sure that a couple of weeks later, there's a familiar pang of guilt as you realise that that inspiration and motivation hasn't actually translated into action. So what I'm wanting to do today is maximise the chances of you walking away and doing things differently as a result of the time and energy you and the state government have invested in today. And you might find that this pattern doesn't play out in the workplace, but that it does play out in other domains of your life. So for some people it might be relationships, might be that you don't have the critical conversations you need to have to keep relationships flourishing. For others it might be around your career. You play small even when you have the desire and the skills to make a bigger contribution. For many of us, Super SA has just reminded us, it's in the financial domain where we know that we need to be making some short-term sacrifices for long-term gain and don't do it. So even if you feel fairly confident around the fact that you're going to put some changes in terms of gender equality into action, you can think of how you can apply the tools we're about to look at in other domains of your life. Because basically, if you're human, it is really difficult to avoid this pattern playing out again and again. So this is what your inner toddler does. You have competing intentions, and goodness knows most people in the room have multiple competing intentions at any given point in time. The adult you, the one who has strongly held values and a deep conscience and knows exactly what's the right course of action, says, oh, I need to spend 5 minutes every day at least before I get started thinking about my top priorities for the day. And if you don't do this, there's lots of research around how beneficial it'll be. Your toddler thinks Twitter. And who usually wins that argument? Let's face it, who wins most arguments between an adult and a toddler? On this occasion, I can tell by the kind of giggle in the room that people know that most of the time we'll execute the easiest action. So rather than write out our 5 top priorities for the day, our toddler hand will reach over, grab the phone and start trawling through Twitter. Basically until your desire for caffeine gets you out of bed. So what I would like you to do now is just spend a few minutes thinking about an activity that you know would be beneficial to you. And it's easy to choose one where the research is really clear-cut that this would be of value. I chose one-on-ones because I coach a lot of leaders and that seems to be a sticking point for lots of people. But use your own example. Describe the specific benefits that would accrue if you undertook that activity on a regular basis. And we've heard a lot today about how small actions are really important in creating big change. And then this is the really critical bit. Identify the specific toddler thought that leads you off track. So one of my favourite examples is that I have a very small walk-in wardrobe that I share with my husband, and he has named it the walk-on wardrobe because of my less than pristine clothing habits. And so I wanted to change this, and you will be, you probably don't care about my wardrobe, but I did and my husband did, that I changed it by realising that the specific thought that I had was, I can pick it up tonight when the kids are in bed. But if you do that over a course of a week and don't follow up with the rational action of picking up, that's when you get the walk-on wardrobe, not a good look. So I really want you to get specific with what is the thought that drives you off course. And then finally, what is the impact of allowing the toddler to direct your action? Okay, the impact on you, on your goals, on your relationships. I only want you to take 3 or 4 minutes to do this. And if you're brave enough, share it with 1 or 2 people on your table, in which case you might want to do something in the personal domain, depending on who's on your table. Take it away. I hope that conversation has all been either about your toddler's impact or about the great things you're going to do to level the playing field. And I hope that in your discussions you have been able to acknowledge to the other people at the table that yes, our brains are deeply flawed. And I think this is a great way to start conversations around unconscious bias. Because if we come from the perspective that to be biased is to be human, we take the sense of accusation that people sometimes, and completely unnecessarily, but do sometimes experience when we start talking about unconscious bias. And I think it's important to look at how phenomenal our brains are at the same time as acknowledging their deficits. So I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about how amazing our brains are, because I think highlighting that can work out how we can draw on their strengths to mitigate some of their weaknesses. So for starters, our brains are at present about 30 times more powerful than the most advanced supercomputer on Earth. And that's pretty phenomenal when you consider that they are portable, they're wireless, and they only weigh about 1.4 kilograms. And unlike computers, our brains don't have a shutdown command. They are working 24/7. They are controlling our every physical move. They're filtering the vast array of information that comes at us through our senses. And they're doing really important things like making sure we keep breathing. Another difference between the brain and the computer is that for the most part, computers are only asked to process the amount of information that they are built to process, not so our poor brains. I imagine everyone in the room will be well aware that the amount of information we're asked to process on a daily basis has increased dramatically even in the past 10 years. and it's supposed to be about 5 times more information that we are asked to filter on a daily basis today than we were in 1985. And just like a computer, when our brain gets overloaded, it starts to slow down, gets a bit sluggish, and it starts making mistakes. Unlike a computer, we don't get the benefit of that little spinning coloured disc to tell us that things aren't going so well. And yes, that spinning disc may make you want to hurl your desktop out the nearest window, but at least you know that performance has fallen below par. Not so with our brains. We don't get an error report, which is why I think in the context of talking about A, turning good intentions into action, and B, talking about unconscious bias, which we are more prone to when our brains are tired, it's also very important to think about cognitive energy and how we manage our cognitive energy and our cognitive load. So some of you may be familiar with the book The Organised Mind by Dr. Daniel Levitin. And he talks about the importance in the 21st century of externalising our cognitive load. So pretty much anything you need to remember, whether it be the name of the person sitting next to you, a cousin's birthday, what it is you need to buy for dinner, or a fantastic idea you have to engage stakeholders, you need to be getting it down on paper. And Levitin strongly recommends that we get it down in the old-fashioned way, with a pencil and a piece of paper, rather, as is my habit, on our reminder list on our phones, because different things happen in our brain, and I don't know the details of that, but I trust this guy, when we write. So I'm sure all of you could stay here till midnight writing out your to-do lists, but I would just like, in the interests of having your full attention for the last 15 minutes of my presentation, for you to do a cognitive dump onto the nearest piece of paper with a pen and write down for about 2 minutes all the things that are top of mind that you think it would serve you to externalise so that you have more cognitive energy to engage in what's going on in the here and now. Okay? Just, again, give you only 2 or 3 minutes. Okay, folks, so I was pretty impressed. Then you're an obedient lot. Lots of people were actually writing. Whether it was a shopping list, I don't know. But even a shopping list is good to externalise. It means you'll actually buy the stuff you need to buy once you get to the supermarket. So the weight of our cognitive load at any given point in time is dependent on a whole range of factors. And one of those factors is the degree to which we conform or reject traditional gender stereotypes. So if you think about the traditional domestic roles, and we know from ABS data that to a surprising degree, the distribution of work and income in a household does not mean that the distribution of domestic work changes. So the ABS estimates that women are still doing about 75% of tasks on the domestic front. And if you think about the traditional female question of, what am I going to cook for dinner tonight? Has about that much cognitive load. The male, traditionally, I'm only speaking traditionally, I'm sure there's lots of people in the room who do not fall into these traditional roles or use HelloFresh to at least avoid the thought of what's it going to be. The traditional male question is, what am I having for dinner tonight? So those two questions might start off being fairly equal. But what am I cooking for dinner tonight becomes, do I need to pick up anything on the way home? Did we finish the zucchini last night? Oh God, are the kids going to like it? And you can see before long that we have a really significant imbalance in cognitive load. And I absolutely believe that that imbalance is a key factor in why many highly capable women choose not to pursue very senior roles. And I think an awareness of the importance of balancing this out, not just in the workplace, but also on the domestic front, is absolutely critical to levelling the playing field. And in fact, I think until we have men leaning in on the domestic front, however much women lean in on the work front, we are still going to find gender equality an elusive goal. So when we're talking about actions today, I would like you to think in terms of actions that can make you a little more rational, and perhaps it can begin to balance out that cognitive load. And what I'd like you to focus on is really small actions. And I didn't know, but today Rabia certainly spoke about it, Christine spoke about it, the importance of those small actions. So why small actions? Well, for one thing, small actions are those that we're much more likely to keep doing than if we set really big challenge goals. Small actions are one that can help us acknowledge the fact that gender equality and achieving it is a test match, not a T20. It can help us to play well and to stay in the game. Whereas if we go for these big transformational changes, when they don't come off as we would like, it's so easy to get dispirited and turn our attention to other matters. And I imagine some of you have seen that cycle around gender equality in the years that you've been in your organisations. And we find big actions so much more appealing. You know, you think of something like a YouTube clip of a woman catching her toddler falling from a fourth floor window, and that has 100 million views. You think of the YouTube clip that shows how to attach a safety lock to that same window, that has maybe 26 views. And yet those small, consistent actions are what over time creates meaningful change. Don't get me wrong, we have people in the room who have the influence, authority to create transformational change. And if you've got that in you, go for it. But what I'd like us to do today at the bare minimum is each commit to a small action that goes toward levelling the playing field. So what might these actions look like? I said around stereotypes, unconscious bias and cognitive load, but I've got a caveat. I would like the women in the room to resist setting any kind of goal or action that is related to building their confidence. First of all, I suspect lots of the women in this room already have a great sense of self-confidence. But even if that's not the case, as other people have said today, for far too long, gender equality initiatives have focused on changing the women, not mitigating bias and changing culture. So just for today, I want us to think not about changing the women, but to think about how each of us we can't change our biases, but how we can mitigate our biases and distribute that cognitive load more easily. And I've run dozens of women in leadership programs, so I know what an incredible impact they can have on individuals, on teams, and occasionally on organisations. And I absolutely believe that building women's confidence is a critical part of any gender equality strategy. But we also need, I think, as Martin said, to be bringing everybody onto the playing field. And that's what I'd like you to do today. So on the back of your strategy, you have your own personal gender equality game plan. What I'd like you to do is, and don't write yet because, again, cognitively, we can't actually do two things well at once, even though many of us would like to believe we could. And that stereotype of women being able to multitask is a load of rubbish. It's just that we have learned how to do lots of things in quick succession very, very well. So your goal is going to ideally be a small action that you can repeat on a daily or at most weekly basis. Your coach might be somebody who you know understands why this action is important, who'll support you, and who, if you skip a day or two, will be a bit of your cheer squad and pull you up. Your training regime, that's about getting really specific about what it is you need to do in order to get that action started. So, example out of the workplace, I feel I've kind of revealed enough of my flaws today, that I needed to make an optometrist appointment. So I had written down optometry appointment, but I had failed to break that small goal into small enough chunks. And what I needed to do first was to phone a friend to get a recommendation. Because I didn't have phone my friend on my list, the optometry appointment was about 6 months in being made. So I want you to make these really, really small actions. And your team. Some of you might want to go it alone, but I thought it was a fantastic example that Martin used of a senior person saying, we've actually agreed to call each other out. So your team can also be a way of getting other people on board and spreading some of the ideas that have been talked about here today. Now, I've got some suggestions for actions up here. The first one, schedule a time to observe what biases are at play in you, because that's one of the most important things we can do, is to acknowledge that we are human and we are biased. The second, to start challenging bias. And I loved the way Christine talked about, well, what are we going to do about that? Doesn't have to be confrontational. We don't have to be aggressive around this stuff. It's like, no, I reckon that's a stereotype. I know plenty of women who don't fall into that category, or men, as the case may be. And ask yourself if the people in your lives with whom you have close relationships, if the cognitive load between you is divided along gender lines. And if you think it is, then ask yourself, what can you do about it? For some of you, that might be delegating some of that cognitive load. And let's be really clear that I know lots of the people in this room will have outsourced lots of the domestic tasks. But even having to liaise with the nursing home or the cleaner or HelloFresh, you know, all those things add up to a really weighty cognitive load. If none of this resonates for you, that's fine. Find your own small action. And I want you to remember, this is one of my favourite slides at the moment, that's what small action looks like over time. The aggregation of marginal gains can lead to really significant changes, not only on the individual front, but also the organisational front. And now I want you to turn to your gender equality game plan and work out what action you're going to take away today to create this kind of change. I'll give you about 5 minutes. So I'm going to try and keep things moving, and I'm aware that you probably are feeling fairly weighty in the cognitive load department after today. One more thing I would like you to do before you put that game plan away, because you probably know that by writing out a little goal, you've increased your chances of actually following through on your good intentions by about 20%. But let's face it, those little, I don't want to say this in front of Tammy, but those little purple postcards, maybe 50% of us will look at them again tomorrow. After that, I imagine there's going to be a fairly steep decline. And as soon as we close today, it's highly likely that those good intentions are going to be squished under 300 thumbs, busily answering texts and emails and listening to voicemails and so on. So I want you to do one final thing that will increase by 200 to 300% your chance of actually doing what you've said you'll do in your game plan. And that's called an implementation intention. And I'm just going to flick through a couple of slides. I've got an example here of exercising. So an implementation intention is when you state precisely when, where, at what time and with whom you will undertake the first action required to implement that goal. And from this particular study, an implementation intention increase someone's chance of exercising a couple of times a week, but from about 35% to 91%. So if you haven't got that specific about your training regime, do so right now. Write it on that game plan, and hopefully your goal will be able to withstand the pressure of those 300 thumbs. I'll give you 1 minute to do that, and then I'll wrap up. Okay, folks. So we've looked at how your toddler brain can impact on your good intentions. Hopefully your game plan will help to keep that toddler brain at bay. If not, your implementation intention should do the trick for a good proportion of you. Because it's the end of the day and I'm into externalising important information, I have a takeaway postcard which will be available at the door with some further tips on managing your cognitive energy. And I think this is a really critical skill, not just in the 21st century workplace, but as a 21st century human being. I'm also launching a blog in a couple of weeks, thinkbetterdobetter.com. It's coming up. And this is the first time I've mentioned it publicly. I would love you to log on and subscribe and be among the first to read the posts that I am currently writing when I'm not falling flat on my face and ignoring my messy home study. On the postcard, there's a piece of advice that some of you will be familiar with. Eat that frog. Brian Tracy uses eating a live frog first thing in the morning as a metaphor for doing what needs to be done, even if it's unpalatable. And because you have been a highly engaged, enthusiastic audience and you've given up your whole day to be here, certainly for me it's been a phenomenal return on investment, and I hope you feel so too. But as an extra special reward, we're not giving you a live frog, we're giving you one courtesy of Haig's. So now is the time where you can let your toddler run loose, unwrap that Haig's frog, savour every moment, and when you get up in the morning, you can remember the metaphor, stick to your game plan and eat that frog. Thank you.
They're too busy eating the frogs. They're ripping open them. For those of you that were really taking heed of what Anna had to say and you were thinking about what you were going to get for dinner on the way home, there's a couple of potatoes up here still left. So if anyone wants them, I'm just going to discreetly place them on the table. Just come up and take them. Okay. Bit of an egg. You've got mock fish. There you go. That's what I always say. Grated potato, bit of a tip for you, and an egg, light fry, beautiful. Coming up next to close the afternoon is a woman who is always rushing around furiously because she has a very, very, very busy life indeed, and a very busy portfolio as the Minister for the Status of Women, particularly on this week, which is of course the week of International Women's Day. So please put your hands together to close our session this afternoon. Zoe Betterson, Minister Zoe Betterson.
Thank you, Amanda. I apologise that I wasn't able to join you earlier because this is a fantastic thing for International Women's Day and the week of International Women's Day, to put this out there about gender equality in leadership. Because it is only with fairness that we will have the shared rights, responsibilities and opportunities for men and for women. When I've been reflecting about gender bias, I think about when I was elected to Parliament. My son was 18 months old. And one of my fellow parliamentarians, who was very lovely to me, but would often say, "Oh, where's Hugo today?" I said, "I left him home by himself." What I would have preferred him to say is, "How are you finding the job? What are you enjoying? What are your unexpected commitments within this position? What do you think you'll be interested in? But his way of connecting to me was to draw attention to what was happening with my childcare. It was interesting. When I look about the bias and what we've had that's impressed us in our life, I think that I was very fortunate because when I was young, my dad came home and looked after us. We were living in Whyalla at the time, in the 70s, and he worked for BHP, as pretty much everyone did. But my mum liked her job more, and she was paid more. And so he came home and looked after us. And I think about that influence on me when I look at my career. And he certainly had his fair share of concern, particularly his own mother, who just didn't understand it, that he was coming home to look after young children. So often when I talk to young women about politics and leadership, I say to them what I asked myself when that opportunity came up, and it was, why not me? Why shouldn't I put my hand up? Why shouldn't I take my seat in Parliament? And I'm very glad I did. But it's a question I think we should all ask ourselves, why not me? And what we want to make sure through this strategy is that those levers are there, that when you say, why not me, we back you in. And as Minister for the Status of Women, along with the Office of the Public Sector, I will back you in because we are going to be the leaders in this area and we need actions for outcomes. And we want to be an exemplar to South Australian businesses. We want to demonstrate that the use of gender equality is a great business enabler. So I look forward to you achieving it with these measures, with these outcomes. Thank you for coming today, and I look forward to seeing you in the future to see the real differences, measure the data of where we've come. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the end. But before we leave, thank you, Minister, for that. That's excellent. I would like to thank IPAA staff and the staff of the Office of the Public Sector for putting this on. Irma, thank you so much. It's been really great. It's a fantastic day. And as a South Australian, although not one that works much in the public sector, I'd just like to say how inspirational it is that the government is taking such a lead on this, and I think it's truly wonderful, and if you can nail it, that will be great for the rest of the state. So well done to you.